Good evening, class. Good evening, class. Good evening, class.
In this video, we're going to talk about depth of field, an artificial technique that makes your pictures look more real. There are many different ways to simulate depth of field. All of these methods use strategic blurring to create an illusion of 3D in a 2D image. Depth of field techniques mimic the limits of human vision. Things beyond our range of vision appear blurred. The computer, though, does not share our limitations. Unless instructed to do otherwise, it will present all images as being clear and in focus no matter how far away they are. To demonstrate this, I set up this fairly deep scene in Poser. The buildings the furthest away rendered just as sharply as those nearest to the camera. Here I applied some depth cueing to get a more natural looking view. Depth of field isn't always all about the eye's limitations, though. It can also be used to indicate our ability to focus. Focus is of particular interest to artists because it reflects both cognition and emotion. We don't just see, we think and react. For example, have you ever been at a party and thought you were looking really cute? You catch a glance of yourself in the mirror and notice, to your horror, that right there in the middle of your face is a great big old zit. Now in reality, the scene still looks just like this. But for the rest of the night, you're going to think that everyone is actually seeing this. Depth of field gives a sense of our subjective reality, not just how things look, but how we feel about them, what seems to be important and meaningful. We're going to start with a couple of techniques for adding the illusion of depth of field in Postwork. The simplest of these is to render the foreground and background separately. Okay, we're going to go to Poser. I've got my foreground figure loaded and ready to go. I go to Import Background Image and bring in the previously rendered picture of my setting to use as reference. As I pose and adjust the lighting to match, be sure you go to the settings for the ground prop and uncheck visible. I didn't do that here, but I'm going to do that in this render. There we go. Now I've got the render that I want, and I'm going to save it as a PNG file. The PNG file setting does not save the imported background picture. Only our figure is rendered. Now we're in Photoshop, and I am going to import my figure as a layer on top of the pre-rendered picture of my setting. Make a few adjustments, and then we're going to apply a nice Gaussian blur to this background layer. So there we go, some very simple, basic depth of field. Now for a fancier version, we remove that. I'm going to go back to the section of the background that is the furthest away and apply a very small amount of Gaussian blur to it. Now we go to the next closest segment of corridor, feather a little bit to make it blend nicely, apply another Gaussian blur. That's also going to blur the segment we blurred first. Now we're going to go to the closest segment, do the same thing, blur. Using this progressive selection, we have a background that is blurred most at the back, least at the front. One problem, though, is sometimes when you render these PNG foregrounds, you get jagged lines around the edges. A little trick to fix this is to go to your blur tool. Be sure that blur all layers is selected. And go through, selectively get rid of that jagged edge. The Blur All Layers setting brings in colors from the background. It's a little bit of a tedious process to do this all the way around your figure, but it's well worth the work, I think.
Good evening, class.
Become familiar with the types of blurs that your graphic program offers. Photoshop has a million and comes out with a new one every day, I think. Here's my favorite, Gaussian blur, that can be adjusted from a gentle fuzz to complete oblivion. Box blur is like Gaussian blur, but boxier. Radial blur can be used for some cool zoom effects. Lens blur is very adjustable, a lot of different settings to play with. Motion blur is great for... Okay, I think you're getting this now. Next, we're going to go over a technique for adding depth of field to an image that doesn't require you to render the foreground and background separately. We are going to be using a layer mask though. Don't get scared, this one's easy. Open your image in Photoshop, duplicate the image. Blur this duplicate as much as you want the image blurred. Select the little circle in a square icon down at the bottom of your layer menu to create a layer mask. Now draw over your figures in black to erase the blur from the places where you don't want it.
Good evening, class.
Now we're going to go over two methods of creating depth of field directly in Poser. There's a similar thing you can do in Daz Studio, but I'm not going over that here. We're going to start with the old-fashioned method that I like best. Here's my image set up and ready to go. I'm going to be using this handsome fella's left eye as my focal point. Go to your Python scripts menu, choose Render Input Output. From that menu, choose Calc Depth of Field Focal Distance. With the left eye selected, it gives me this little number. Choose the camera you're going to use. Copy the focal distance number for the left eye that the Python script gave you to the focal distance setting for the camera you're going to use. You also need to adjust the camera's f-stop. Usually it's way too low, 2.8. That's far too blurry. 14 is good. 7 I use also, but definitely not 2.8. Too blurry. Go to your render settings. Make sure depth of field is checked. And here's our render with that left eye nicely in focus and the background very blurred.
Good evening, class.
Next, we're going to use Poser's newfangled focal distance tool. Get your image ready and pull up the camera that you're going to do and find the focal distance dial. Click on this dial and hold it down. As you do, this spidery looking thing will appear. Adjust it until it's in line with whatever part of the body that you want to be your focal point. I don't like this tool because I find it hard to manipulate, and I always end up doing exactly what I did here. I thought I was focusing on the eye, but actually I had it aimed at the character's hand instead. You still have to make sure that you've changed the f-stop to something reasonable and gone through and checked that depth of field box.
Good evening, class. Good evening, class.
Okay, now for some fancy stuff. We're going to use a layer mask that we make in Poser. First, get your scene like you want it and render it. Then go back and select each light and check off. Unselect the visibility button for any of your props and then render your figure all by itself. Make sure you export it as a PNG file. Take this silhouette to Photoshop and make sure that you get the contrast very, very sharp. all black and white. As you did before when we were working with a layer mask, make sure that you have made a duplicate of your original layer and blurred it the way you wanted. You can just simply use the silhouette to create a selection and then clear the figure out of the blurred layer, achieving much the same effect as we did before without fooling around with this layer mask stuff at all.
Good evening, class. Good evening, class.
Or, like I said before, we can use it to make a layer mask. Make your silhouette all black and white, filling in the cleared area with white. Add a layered mask to your blurred layer and copy this silhouette to your layer mask. This makes for a very, very precise layer mask if you've got a lot of stray hairs to deal with, or if you want to add something to the picture later, like fog, curly fog, like I'm doing here for some reason.
Good evening, class. Good evening, class. Good evening, class.
And now for the fanciest stuff of all. We're going to create depth of fill using a Z-depth map. You can buy a plugin that will make one of these beauties for you, but I'm going to show you how. After you've rendered your scene to your satisfaction, go back in and turn any lights off. Go into the material room, choose atmosphere, make sure that depth cueing is on. You can render on low settings. You don't need a lot of detail for this. And here's what your Z-depth map should look like. Figures closest to you in black, furthest away, nearest to white. Now we're back in Photoshop with your render. Bring in your Z-depth map, make sure that you've desaturated it, copy it, open up the channel tab, and add your Z-depth map as a new channel. Unclick it and re-click all the other channels so the image will display correctly. Duplicate your image, but this time instead of going to Gaussian blur, we're going to go to lens blur. It will read depth map, source, make sure it says alpha 1. Alpha 1 is the channel where you put your Z depth map. This is what it's going to use as the basis for its blur. There's a lot of other settings that you can play around with to get different effects. It'll think about it a minute, and here's your blur. I think the Z-maps create the nicest, most subtle depth of fill effect of all. In fact, I like it so much I'm going to show you another one. Here's an image with a very long depth of field. Here's the Z-map that I rendered, but I needed to modify it a little bit to include both of the figures. And here's the Z-map applied to make some very nice blurring in the background while keeping the figures in the foreground clear.
Good evening, class.
Although we started out pretty simple with the Z-maps and the masking layers, we're getting into some pretty complicated stuff. If you can master these, I think you're well on your way to calling yourself an intermediate post worker instead of just a beginner. I do hope you'll try. I think you'll find it's well worth your effort.
Good evening, class. Good evening, class. Good evening, class. Good evening, class.